I'm going to talk about research issues on interactive robots at home and hospitals. Actually, I'll try to make some bridges to things discussed here and yesterday and today in the morning. First of all, this will be about indoors robotics, and we have been talking about this might be interesting to have indoor robotics as a challenge for MZIRC. Also, this will also be about robot competitions and some issues. Not only, there are applications we did which are not for competitions, but it will be illustrated by some of them and some issues that arise. Anyway, I come from the Institute for Systems and Robotics at Instituto Superior Técnico. I won't say much about it as some of the other speakers did, because yesterday Alberto could say a bit since the team was involved in Challenge 3. And today there will be another talk where Mazen Basiri will say more about it. But I will tell you a bit about, to give you some context and background about what my group at ISR does. The group I coordinate, it is called Intelligent Robots and Systems. And we always try to approach the systems we are dealing with from an holistic viewpoint. That is, we do not focus, say, on navigation or on vision or on manipulation. If we have a focus, it's probably more on planning and decision-making and uncertainty, these kind of things, multi-robot systems, networked robot systems. But the idea is really to try to see how we put together the different subsystems and do this with a systems approach, which typically combines also, because of the background of the people in the group, not just me, that comes from a mix of control and AI, which is a bit unusual, but brings, I think, some interesting flavor. And I will particularly focus, of course, from the title, on interactive assistive robots. We have been doing other kind of stuff, but today it will be more about this, because it raises a lot of research challenges, and the list here is more or less what I'm going to illustrate then in the rest of the talk. I mean, you see pictures that more or less will be repeated next on hospitals, at home. This, we see it as a challenge for us to develop research, publish, do PhD theses, go to competitions on things like generating task plans under uncertainty, generating them from speech commands of the human we are interacting with, to do vision-based mobile grasping, to do active semantic mapping, to do human and social aware navigation, and this will build some bridges with Ron Arkin's speech before, and probably, I guess, with Rashid Alami next. The same with design and execution of social behaviors. And I'll talk also a bit about different types of navigation, which is an interesting topic if we look at it not just from the usual waypoint navigation viewpoint. Okay. A little bit more dense slide just to motivate people for one of the things I will be talking about, which is assistive robots in pediatric hospitals. It is true that, and we saw what Ron said before from that poll to European citizens, that people have, surprisingly for us, or supposedly also, a negative view of robots in hospitals. However, I think, and also talking to the people who are like the medical doctors and nurses, I think this is kind of a bias in the poll, in the sense that the point is, it depends on how we use them. If we are going to put their robots and replace all the humans, and they are supposed to assist the people who are in the hospital, that's not probably a good idea. But if we use the robots to relieve the nurses and doctors from some tasks and pay more attention to their patients, if we use them in situations where they are really important and may even do a better task than humans, like some points, some items I have here, this can be actually quite positive. And this is what I'll try to convince you about the hospitals and also about domestic environments. So cases, and illustrated by cases we work with, which I will show you some work afterwards, where the benefits are good and positive and not only potential, as I wrote. is that there are some kind of hospitalized situations where children, in this particular case I'm dealing with children, get there for a long time and they get distressed. So if we can interact with them, if we can even participate in classes of education, I'm talking about an application to oncological hospitals, so they really may stay there in a difficult situation for a long time. This can actually be very interesting for them because they engage in games, they engage with the robots. On the other hand, from the viewpoint of the technology, hospitals are a fairly structured environment where you can already take advantage of things which are there to use the robots. And there are also ways of measuring the success metrics because this has to do with more objective points, like the number of times that the children request interaction with the robots, but also subjective ones that you can measure, such as degree of happiness from questionnaires. Then there's a particular class, which is autism spectrum disorder, ASD children, which indeed have been shown over the years, and we are not surely the first ones to use robots with them. They actually somehow have a preference to interact with machines rather than with people in certain cases, because somehow they feel that since they are socially shy, this device is something they can interact with without frightening them so much. And we have observed that indeed in some application we did, which I will show you. So let's go first to the application to oncological hospitals, and I'll tell you about a robot we developed within the frame of an European project that my group coordinated. The coordinator was my colleague João Sequeira, and this was the so-called M-Bot robot, which actually the children then rebaptized, and I'll tell you later about this next slide. This is based on a networked robot system. It's based on a lot of game interactions and on daily interaction activities. The robot that you see there, not from here, it's too bad, but the robot you see there, it's actually a robot that was initially designed from ideas that the children gave. We challenged them to provide designs of what would be a nice robot for them. And of course, taking into account also that he was going to interact mostly with kids, so it's kind of a short robot. You can see here the evolution of the construction of the robot, so you can also see it's inside, and you see it here in actual operation in the hospital. This was an H2020 project, which is over already, called Monarch. Let me give you a glimpse through a video of what the people, actually the director of the pediatric ward, says about the advantage of this system. I will have to do some jumps, otherwise it stays too long. Oh, the kids called it Little Casper because it's a white robot. In Portuguese, Gasparzinho. Can you hear the sound? No, it's only me, right? Maybe now? Yeah.
Este robô é um robô cuja única função é interagir socialmente com as pessoas. É um projeto europeu que envolve o Instituto Superior Técnico, que coordena, e mais, neste momento, 8 instituições portuguesas e europeias.
O seu poderá ser das diversas ocupações. É que, de facto, este pode ser um gadget.
This is the director of the Hospital Pediatric Ward.
Em vez de ser um gadget que promove a solidão de cada um com o seu. Portanto, poderá ser a tecnologia a reunir crianças e não a isolá-las cada uma no seu pequeno ecrã.
This is actually very important, and it's a distinctive issue of why the robots can be important in an application in a hospital like this one. And I like particularly what this mother of hospitalized children that is here encouraging her to interact with the robot, what she says in the end. Let me just show you this part, which is particularly funny.
Algumas pessoas já o batizaram.
Okay, now it was before. Anyway.
Para eles isto tudo acaba por ser um pouco natural. Para nós é que é assim muito inovador, mas para eles acho que estas coisas já vão sendo naturais. E acho ótimo o nosso país estar a participar num projeto destes.
So the point is exactly that for the children, what for us might seem kind of artificial or even frightening, this is quite natural because they were born in a world which is already full of technology, so that also helps. Well, some of the things we do in the hospital, just to give you an example, are like this, a game where you have a network device that projects on the ground. It's the Flow-Free game that some mobile phones have actually as an app, and it's an interactive and cooperative and competitive game because both the children and the robot have to together find the right paths from one point to another and fill the grid with those paths between several points. And so what is happening is that that girl is cooperating with the robot to successfully finish the game, and the robot autonomously not only moves between cells but shows through the projector what she should do next, encouraging her to cooperate with him. Okay, another project we engaged in more recently, and it's over now but just for a few months, is the one with ASD children. In this case, the robot that was kind of derived of the M-Bot. Initially, we even used the M-Bot, but it was a new robot with some particular characteristics for this application. And it was called Astro. What is particularly distinctive here, because there's many people working on robots with ASD children, is that our robot is mobile and interacts fully autonomously. It's not just a kind of a standing robot that encourages the kid to do some things. It really encourages the kid to do it while moving around, talking to him or her, and also showing the way to solve some problems so as to engage the ASD kid to become more social. In this case, we have those cameras up there which detect RGBD cameras, which cover all the room and detect the position of the children, which is essential for the robot then to have a pose that looks at the children, having its LCD showing expressions while it speaks and encourages the children to play. And one particular thing we wanted to solve was to use speech and understand what the kid wanted to do. That showed, we worked with a speech processing partner, but that showed to be really difficult because the kids don't always say very perceptive words, or they don't even talk because they are shy. In that case, what the trick we did was to use a microphone for the therapist, and she basically gives the robot some context, saying, well, now it's the puzzle game, or now it's to open the door. And that helped. And another important thing that you see here on the left is that we initially had the idea that it would be very difficult within the lifetime of the project to achieve a fully autonomous system. So we tried with a Wizard of Oz approach, where we designed very nice interfaces for the people who are, if you look at the picture here, these people are hidden from the child here in this area. It's kind of a mirrored window, so he does not see anyone behind. But it was initially controlling the robot to override the actions it would decide autonomously to take, and also to override the perception that was wrong. What happened is that we learned through the process how to do these corrections, and at some point, so the interfaces are here, this is just to put together behaviors. This one is the action console to override actions and see what is the action being applied. And this is the perception console, where you can see, for instance, in this case, the location of the kid as perceived by the system and the location of the robot. But we learned how to do it, how to correct it in such a way that, in fact, we could have an autonomous robot. And you can see it here again with some sound is interesting and some translation, because the dialogue is in Portuguese, with the kid. And I find it particularly interesting to show. So the environment has several, you see the ball there hidden from the kid, has several features ready for the type of pilot experiments that they usually do with only human therapists with the kid. So the kid comes to the room and they start engaging him into games, like grabbing balls and putting in the belly of the robot, or moving an obstacle from the way because the robot wants to go to a puzzle. In fact, these experiments they used to do with only humans, we did it with the robots 35 times, and there's a study and a paper that uses results of that study. Okay, so the robot is talking to Gabriel, and encouraging him to play. And you see it looks at the kid because the cameras give the information of where the kid is. Okay, and at some point, now he is encouraging this girl to find balls and put in his belly, which she did already, and he encourages her a lot to continue, and so she now is engaged. So far, this is somehow static, but now here he says he has a tablet. You can touch the screen in his chest, and this is more interactive. And finally, I'm playing here with the... And finally, this one I like particularly because now the continuation of the game is to put a piece that is missing in the puzzle that it shows in its touch screen. So the robot tries to bring the kid to the place where the puzzle is, but finds an obstacle. And now he has to show the kid that she should remove the obstacle and engage her into this other activity. That's the point. And see what he does. Detects the obstacle with the laser, of course. Okay, and now he even shows some impatient because he's trying to enter but cannot. And she finally moves the obstacle and he and he moves ahead. Okay, so as I said, we did 35 experiments, which is an interesting number, on the same setup where they used to do it with humans, but using the robot, and even having comparisons between the two types of approaches to see if it provided effects on the kids. In fact, they are taking it very carefully because they really have to demonstrate that there are or not advantages, and so they cannot claim there is scientific evidence or experimental evidence that there are improvements, but in some cases some interesting things were observed. There was one kid that usually did never talk, and he started speaking, and the first word he said was the name of the robot, which is kind of interesting. Okay, now moving out of hospitals and to domestic robots. Here also, I think that sometimes we try to push robots that do the daily core activities, and the problem is that this is probably still a bit out of reach, though yesterday Tamin showed us amazing examples of maybe it's not that true anymore. But on the other hand, definitely robots may be interesting to help people at home which are either sick or have some disabilities, because then, especially if they are, at least for some time, alone, they really need the robot to go and fetch objects for them, to do some of other activities in the home, even to, say, receive people that they cannot do because they are in bed, let's say. Or even warn an health center if an accident is detected by the robot that is moving around and checking where the person is. So this, for us, came a lot from robot competitions, facing these problems and tackling them through research approaches. One of them, of course, was RoboCup at Home. Another one was one of the first projects in Europe about robot competitions called ROCKIN, which is now continued by the so-called European Robotics League in several other projects, and where one of the challenges is exactly about domestic robots. And there are several task benchmarks, which in fact act as things you want to solve and that you want to repeat several times. I talked about this this morning, so as to evaluate how reliable the robots are doing it. One of them is to just go around and build a semantic map of the home, which is necessary for the rest. That's the getting to know my home. Another one is welcoming the visitors. There's a doctor coming, but there may be other visitors, and each of them have to be handled differently. Say the doctor can go to the room where Granny Annie, which is the person that is targeted by the user story, where she is, because she knows the doctor, so he's allowed to do that. So he has to be recognized by his face, while, for instance, the postman just has to be recognized by uniform because he will be allowed just to deliver a package to the robot at the entrance of the door. And for that, we also have, you can see there, the home that was used actually in Toulouse with the big help of Rashid in the first rocking competition. So we have several test beds like this all over Europe right now, 7 meeting the rules of the ERL former rocking. And so we can benchmark the teams if they go to different competitions in different places, which also makes it a little bit less expensive if they go to the closest place. And there, what they can do is, for instance, to use the networked robot system that is installed together with the test bed, with a camera that looks at the front door and checks who is the person arriving. There's also things like catering for Granny Annie's comfort that mean with a networked system of actuators to put off and on lights remotely, to pick up objects by the robot in other rooms. Anyway, several things you can do with such a system. I'll go through a few of the things that we did, not all, to have these systems working according to the challenges of RoboCup at home and of ERL, as we call it, consumer service, just to illustrate some of the things that we did that I find interesting from the viewpoint of research, though there will be many more. One of them is that currently the way the work operates is there's a human giving commands like go and get this object from a given room, or even more than one, go and find this person, and then go and get this object and then give it to the person you found before. And it's given by speech. So first the speech has to be recognized. It has to be translated into text by a natural language understanding system. And then this is finally translated, by an automatic speech recognition system. And then the text is translated into intentions and arguments that go to a PDDL planner, which tell the robot what to do. This makes it fairly general, so that we can really give, at least from a given set of sentences and commands, we can tell the robot what to do. And the robot then has to execute the several tasks coordinating subsystems such as navigation, grasping, some of those that I will show you next. Well, the sample input and output of the system is shown here, just to illustrate better what I said. Like if you ask the robot, could you bring the ball from the bedroom to Peyton at the kitchen? He will say that bring the ball is the action, the object is the ball, the source location, the person detection location will all, destination location will all also be identified, and this will be passed to the planner. Another thing which we have been working a lot on, and with several works, is on vision-based mobile grasping, because the robot has to go and grab an object. Currently, we have a not so good arm, which we are actually right now in the process of changing for a Kinova. So we adapted the original robot of the Monarch project that did not have arms. He only had to interact like this with the kids by a manipulator. And we have several different types of approaches. In this case, we have the camera, an RGB camera on the top of the head of the robot, and we really do an eye-to-end approach, and we do position-based visual serving. You can see there that we recognize the object that we want to grasp using that camera. We plan how to get there by manipulator, and so we tell actually the pose of the grasping that should be achieved, and then we compare that with the current end effector pose of the manipulator, and we control it in order to move the manipulator towards the object. Now, what is interesting here in this particular work that was published in ICLA 2019, and it's from a master student with a colleague of mine and several other people, is that the robot, I'm sorry, we don't need the sound here. The robot uses all its degrees of freedom. Today and yesterday someone was mentioning that it's important to go beyond the mobile manipulation where you stop and then you manipulate and then you move the arm. Here we use the degrees of freedom of the mobile base, which is omnidirectional, and we also use, of course, the degrees of freedom of the manipulator. This was a demo during RoboCup at in Montreal in 2018. Not a demo, sorry, one of the challenges. And in this case, really, initially the robot stopped and now uses the arm, but you see it moving because the object is far away, so it really has to move. The cable there is not for energy. We had problems with wireless internet, with wireless network, as you know well, it's usually a problem, and we had to provide it with a cable, that's all, but it works, that's not the issue. So now he takes the object and see, we want to put it inside a bag that it recognizes, and this is perhaps the most interesting part, because then he keeps tracking the bag and extending his arm to put the object in the bag. And these motions, you see, they are not pre-planned. What happens is that we have a model, it's not an MPC, it only has, it's kind of greedy, it has an horizon of one step only, but we put weights in several different things. We want the base to be aligned with the object, we want to be more natural, we want the joints to have limits so that they don't get, here for instance they are a little bit entangled, but now the robot will start extending his hand. By this, and by changing the weights of the different components of the manipulation, the different joints, we achieve a motion which is more or less natural, but which in fact takes into account all the degrees of freedom. So, of course, he was running away with the bag on purpose to show all this. Okay, another thing is about decision making. In this case, what we wanted to show was how to use decision making under uncertainty to tell the robot where to go in different rooms if he wants to actively maintain a semantic map. But a semantic map where locations of objects are known with uncertainty associated to it. In this work that was published in ICAPS 2019, what we did was to combine ProbLog, which is probabilistic logic, representation of the word and inference of what to do, to select from a set of POMDPs, partially observable Markov decision processes, each of one associated to a room. Within that room, the POMDP decides, in this case does not decide to take an action, can do that. The video I'm going to show you is another type of POMDP that actually we also introduced in the past, which is a POMDP that rewards for increasing the belief about the location of an object. So in this case, it rewards more sharp beliefs. For instance, if we want to reduce the uncertainty about the environment, we choose the POMDP with a lower expected rewards value because it means it has low information and it needs to go to this place to know more. While if it would be to carrying out a task, we would have to choose the more obvious thing, which is the one with the higher expected rewards value. You can see here this in action, accelerated. I should know for how much, but I'm not hiding this from you, but I don't remember now, to be honest. And let me show you, this is kind of long, so I can just explain you meanwhile. On the left, you see the current global belief about three objects, Coca-Cola can, mug, gray, and Pringles, in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 locations. Which you see, like the dining table, the coffee table, the kitchen table. And what the robot is doing is moving around to maintain a belief of where these three objects are. You see the big picks mean it knows very well where they are. Right now, for instance, it knows that the Coca-Cola is in the coffee table, the mug gray is in the kitchen table, and so on. And it keeps moving to maintain this. And once in a while, someone comes just to get the robot in troubles. Now it found that the Coca-Cola is... no, it is in the bed. The Pringles are in the bed, sorry. Now someone came, changed the objects, and when the robot gets to locations where they were, of course, the perception belief decreases. So the robot keeps going because now he has to go somewhere else to see where this object is. And he keeps doing it and being able to maintain this belief, and this way knowing where the objects are, which is fundamental then to do actions like going there and grabbing them if someone asks, get me the Coca-Cola, for instance. On the right, you just see the observations and using YOLO, how we, after training, how we detect the objects. Okay, I have to rush here. Just quickly showing you some things that we do about what I call multimodal navigation. This one was recent in Milton Keynes. The European Robotics League had a competition on smart cities, and the robot had to go to a fairly realistic environment, which is a coffee, actually from Costa Cafe, and he had to go through different waypoints where the people are to identify the objects on the table and if there were customers waiting, because then he had to go and serve them. And so this is waypoint navigation, just using MCL for localization, move base, and so on. But then at the end of the task, so he finishes, there's a customer waiting, and in this case, he has to guide the customer. So it switches into another navigation mode where he uses the camera to detect where the person is and guides him, in this case, until the place where there's an empty space. So it still uses another way of navigation, which is more difficult than waypoint. And the third way that we also used, and actually some of this work has been done by one of the persons involved in the team here, Rui, he is actually tracking a person. So now it is following, not guiding. And you see there, you see on the left the particle spread to locate the robot, but also to locate the person, the estimated locations of both, sometimes with mistakes. But the robot is able to do that and simultaneously avoid other people or other obstacles, which is usually a conflicting issue and brings problems. So we also accomplished this mode of navigation. Now, just a brief thing about formation control of robots to introduce the final part, which is about how groups of robots can behave with human and social awareness. So this is a PhD thesis that actually is going to be defended in a couple of weeks between IST and EPFL of Alicia Vazik, together with Alkerio Martinoli, my colleague co-advising. So Alicia, first of all, did some work on formation control using flexible methods, graph-based approaches, consensus-like methods, which allow the robots to naturally adjust their geometry if they move from large spaces to narrow spaces and so on. While here there's some novelty, but not like too much, the important thing is that the formation controller is ready to receive kind of a molding function that tells the robots what they should do in each moment. And then, not only they behave kind of naturally, like in this case here, as you will see, we can use that particular feature to then, so this is not pre-planned. I mean, the robots, there's a leader, and they had to find space to let the leader move on and be following him in a given geometry, and they did it like this. But this way, what happens is that we have a means of, when we determine what the group of robots should do by social rules or navigation, human-aware navigation rules, we can just do that by changing this function that molds the behavior of the robots. And that's what was done, for instance, here, where a participative study that was done at EPFL the robots have markings on the top so that they can be tracked by a motion capture system, so that to get the ground truth and then be able to check the results about their real locations versus estimated. And there's a group of people, you see they are reading because they have instructions to always repeat the same set of behaviors such that we can compare between the different situations. In this case, the robots are completely unsocial. So they may sometimes even, of course, they avoid the humans, but they may be quite annoying the way they behave. But at some point, let me see where we are. Yeah, it's now. At some point, we switch into maximal social norms compliance, and now the robots behave on the other extreme. They are very careful not to be too close to the humans, for instance, even though sometimes it's quite challenging like here, but you see that they were behaving quite carefully as a group. And you see some of this with individual robots. What is novel here is the fact that we do this with a group of robots versus a group of humans. And now, finally, kind of the most efficient approach is when you put them together, balancing the two parts. So they are, they are efficient enough, they are social aware enough, but they are not also too careful, otherwise they may not be able to do what they have to do. So this is kind of a combination of the previous two. Okay, so I have to rush, sorry, I'd like to show you more, but finally, the point is this was more only on navigation, but what about the behavior of the robots being social aware? Here we introduced an idea that comes from already some years of bringing institutions seen in a general way. It's not just like a court or a parliament. Say a roundabout can be an institution. It has a material part, the cars have to avoid it, but then it has a rules part, which is the rules to follow on the right or on the left to avoid it, so that there's coordination between the different stakeholders involved. In this case, that work was initially proposed more theoretically. Then there were a couple of students with us, and also in Orebro, Stevan Tomic, together with Alessandro Safiotti and Federico Pecora, worked on doing this applied to agents, like they have norms, roles, actions, conditions, knowledge, but then they have to be grounded into actual domains, like what are the actors that take the roles, what are the behaviors that represent the actions. And what Alicia added here was norm realization. How do we actually implement this in the actual robots, not just leaving them as agents? They need really to do something that can even be different for the same set of norms and domains, if there are different situations. And so this is what she did. Actually, this is in Orebro, a complete joint work between all of us, and was recently accepted for, not recently, 1 year ago, for the robotics and automation letters. This is two phases. There's two robots, one guiding the other one in the back, leading two humans to a room. And then when they get to the room, one of them stays and the other one goes inside, where there's a third robot, a Pepper in this case. These are M-bots. The other one inside the room will be a Pepper, which goes into another phase of guiding the humans to show them different things interesting in the room. And so you can see that they are actually realizing the norms naturally just by keeping one robot guiding the humans. The other one sometimes has to stop or to make the front one stops because the humans were moving in a different, kind of moving out of the formation. When they enter the room, now Pepper starts explaining where different things are, while one of the robots stayed at the corridor and the other one comes and goes to the places where Pepper tells the robots, the humans to go. What is relevant here is that we can remove the one institution and put another, and the robots will behave differently without having to do anything else. I see George shooting me out. And so I will actually, this is my last slide. I will leave you, and if you want, you can even ask questions while the slide is playing, with something I like very much from 2018 in RoboCup, where we see our robot doing a lot of the things I talked about in the challenge, which is called Help Me Carry. He has to go out of the home, to a car which is supposedly there to help this person to pick up a bag from there and bring back to the home. This has a lot of issues because it has to go to a place that was not so well mapped before. It has to avoid obstacles which show unexpectedly, and some of them are not even seen by the laser. It has to use the RGBD camera on the top. He has to do manipulation, and initially, though I did not put sound, he had to also use the microphone to understand what the person wanted him to do. And now he's following the person as well. So I don't know if you want to start asking questions. Or...
Very much, Pedro. Yes, it's so easy, right? It's indoors, right?
What is that?
It's so easy. It's indoors.
It's indoors, exactly. But everyone said that it should be next challenge.
Okay. So, any questions for Pedro? Yes, please. Can you pass the microphone?
He's now, while we wait for Luis, he's now getting to the place where he's going to get the bag. Luis, go ahead.
So, thanks a lot for the presentation. Fantastic. I mean, I know your work very well, but I think it's anyway amazing. But I would like just to ask about the competition aspect. So when we put humans there, because I think it's something we have to do, then it comes to my mind how to replicate this, because when we have humans and we interact with them, the actions of the humans will depend a little bit on the actions of the robot. So how are you dealing with this in this kind of competitions, and try to make replicable the different challenges when humans are there?
As I think you know, in the ERL, we are definitely trying to do benchmarking with the robots, with the objects, locations. We even have motion capture system in some of the test beds to see where they are, and the ground truth, I mean, to compare them with what they do. With the humans, we can do something similar to what Alicia did at EPFL. That's the idea. We have not done it yet, true. And so not only we don't track, but we also don't enforce too much the repeatability of the behavior. But in some cases we do. Mason is there, is usually a judge in this, and he knows that he tells the volunteers to move in front of the robot when he is navigating, always using the same pattern for all the teams. So we are going in that direction. It's tremendously important. Yeah, you're right.
Yes, please.
Short question. Thank you for the presentation. I know your work for many, many years. Just one question about how easy it was to get the parents to accept the filming and dissemination of all the experiments.
How easy is to get what, sorry?
The consent of the parents to show the videos about their kids, I mean, to record the kids.
Autism aspect, hospitals.
Yeah. Okay. It is difficult. In fact, we had two different experiences. With the oncological hospital, of course, it's more difficult. We have to be careful with a lot of things, including what we can show or not. And for instance, I'm showing here because it's a scientific meeting. Otherwise, I could not show some of those things. In the autistic case, in fact, the hospital was very open. I mean, it was much more of even of collaboration in the sense that they really wanted us to be part of their experiments, the pilots they do with the kids to improve their health, because they believe this could really help. And so in that sense, it was much more open and easy. They really engaged into it. Not that the others did not engage, but they were much more cautious, and so somehow we found more resistance, which is natural, I think.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? No? I think it's time to go. Thank you very much, Pedro.
Thank you.
Thank you.